History of the Peloponnesian War, Book 1, Introduction, Section 1. Thucydides the Athenian wrote the history of the war fought between Athens and Sparta, beginning the account at the very outbreak of the war, in the belief that it was going to be a great war, and more worth writing about than any of those which had taken place in the past. My belief was based on the fact that the two sides were at the very height of their power and preparedness, and I saw too that the rest of the Hellenic world was committed on one side or the other. Even those who were not immediately engaged were deliberating on the courses which they were to take later. This was the greatest disturbance in the history of the world of the Hellenes, affecting also a large part of the non-Hellenic world, and indeed I might also say the whole of mankind. For though I found it impossible, because of its remoteness in time, to acquire a really precise knowledge of the distant past, or even of the history preceding our own period, yet, after looking back into it as far as I can, all evidence leads me to conclude that these periods were not great periods of either warfare or anything else. Section 2. It appears, for example, that the country now called Hellas had no settled population in ancient times. Indeed, there was a series of migrations, as the various tribes, being under the constant pressure of invaders who were stronger than they were always prepared to abandon their own territory. There was no commerce, and no safe communication either by land or sea. The use they made of the land was limited to the production of necessities. They had no surplus left over for capital, and no regular system of agriculture, since they lacked the protection of fortifications, and at any moment an invader might appear and take their land away from them. Thus, in the belief that the day-to-day necessities of life could be secured just as well in one place as in another, they showed no real reluctance in moving their homes, and therefore built no cities of any size or strength, nor acquired any important resources. Where the soil was most fertile, there were the most frequent population changes, as in what is now called Thessaly and Boeotia, in most of the Peloponnese, except Arcadia, and in the other rich parts of Hellas. For in the fertile districts it was easier for individuals to secure greater powers than their neighbors. This led to disunity, which often caused the collapse of these states, which in any case were more likely than others to attract the attention of foreign invaders. It is interesting to observe that Attica, which because of the poverty of her soil was remarkably free from political disunity, has always been inhabited by the same race of people. Indeed, this is an important example of my theory that it was because of migrations that there was an uneven development elsewhere. For when people were driven out from other parts of Greece by war or by disturbances, the most powerful of them took refuge in Athens, as being a stable society. Then they became citizens, and soon made the city even more populous than it had been before, with the result that Attica became too small for her inhabitants, and colonies were sent out to Ionia. Another point which seems to me good evidence for the weakness of the early inhabitants of the country is this. We have no record of any action taken by Hellas as a whole before the Trojan War. Indeed, my view is that at that time the whole country was not even called Hellas. Before the time of Hellen, that's with two L's, the son of Deucalion, the name did not exist at all, and different parts were known by different names of different tribes, with the name Pelasgian predominating. After Hellen and his sons had grown powerful in Pythiotis, and had been invited as allies into other states, these states separately and because of their connections with the family of Hellen began to be called Hellenic. But it took a long time before the name ousted all other names. The best evidence for this can be found in Homer, who, though he was born much later than the time of the Trojan War, nowhere uses the name Hellenic for the whole force. Instead, he keeps this name for the followers of Achilles, who come from Pythiotis and were in fact the original Hellenes. For the rest, in his poems, Homer uses the words Danaans, Argives, and Achaeans. He does not even use the term foreigners. This is because in his time the Hellenes were not yet known by one name, so marked off as something separate from the outside world. By Hellenic I mean here both those who took on the name city by city, as the result of common language, and those who later are called by the common name. In any case, these various Hellenic states, weak in themselves and lacking communications with one another, took no collective action before the time of the Trojan War, and they could not have united even for the Trojan expedition unless they had previously acquired a greater knowledge of seafaring. Minos, according to tradition, was the first person to organize a navy. He controlled the greater part of what is now called the Hellenic Sea. He ruled over the Cyclades, in most of which he founded the first colonies, putting his sons in as governors after they had driven out the Carians. And it is reasonable to suppose that he did his best to put down piracy in order to secure his own revenues. For in these early times, as communication by sea became easier, so piracy became a common profession both among the Hellenes and among the barbarians who lived on the coast and in the islands. The leading pirates were powerful men, acting both out of self-interest and in order to support the weak among their own people. They would descend among cities which were unprotected by walls, and indeed consisted of only scattered settlements, and by plundering such places they would gain most of their livelihood. At this time, such a profession, so far from being regarded as disgraceful, was considered quite honorable. It is an attitude that can be illustrated even today by some of the inhabitants of the mainland, among whom successful piracy is regarded as something to be proud of. And in the old poets, too, we find that the regular question asked of those who arrive by sea is, "Are you pirates?" It is never assumed that either those who were so questioned should shrink from admitting the fact, or that those who were interested in finding out the fact would reproach them with it. Section 6. The same system of armed robbery prevailed by land, and even up to the present day much of Hellas still follows the old way of life. Among the Ozolian Locrians, for instance, and the Aetolians and the Acarnanians, and the others who live on the mainland in that area, among these people the custom of carrying arms still survives from the old days of robbery. From at one time, since houses were unprotected and communications unsafe, this was a general custom throughout the whole of Hellas, and it was the normal thing to carry arms on all occasions, as it is now among foreigners. The fact that the peoples I mentioned still live in this way is evidence that once this was a general rule among all the Hellenes. The Athenians were the first to give up the habit of carrying weapons and to adopt a way of living that was much more relaxed and more luxurious. In fact, the elder men of the rich families who had these luxurious tastes only recently gave up wearing linen undergarments and tying their hair behind their heads in a knot fastened with a clasp of golden grasshoppers. The same fashion spread to their kinsmen in Ionia, and lasted there among the old men for some time. It was the Spartans who first began to dress simply and in accordance with their modern taste. With the rich leading a life that was as much as possible like the life of ordinary people, they, too, were the first to play games naked, to take off their clothes openly, and to rub themselves down with olive oil after their exercise. In ancient times, even in the Olympic Games, the athletes used to wear coverings for their loins, and indeed, this practice was still in existence not very many years ago. Even today, many foreigners, especially in Asia, wear these loincloths for boxing matches and wrestling bouts. Indeed, one could point to a number of other instances where the manners of the Hellenic world are very similar to the manners of foreigners today. Section 7. Cities were sited differently in the later periods, for as seafaring became more general and capital reserves came into existence, new walled cities were built actually on the coasts, and isthmuses were occupied for commercial reasons and for purposes of defense against neighboring powers. Because of the wider prevalence of piracy, the ancient cities, both in the islands and on the mainland, were built at some distance from the sea, and still remain to this day on their original sites. For the pirates would rob not only each other, but everyone else, seafaring or not, who lived along the coast. Section 8. Piracy was just as prevalent in the islands among the Carians and the Phoenicians, who in fact colonized most of them. This was proved during their present war, when Delos was officially purified by the Athenians, and all the graves on the island were opened up. More than half of those graves were Carian, and could be seen from the type of weapons buried with the bodies and from the method of burial, which was the same that is still used in Caria. But after Minos had organized a navy, sea communications improved. He sent colonies to most of the islands and drove out the notorious pirates, with the result that those who lived in the sea coast were now in the position to acquire wealth and live a more settled life. Some of them, on the strength of the new riches, built walls for their cities. The weaker, because of their general desire to make profits, were content to put up with being governed by the stronger, and those who won superior power by acquiring capital resources brought the smaller cities under their control. Hellas had already developed some ways along the lines when the expedition to Troy took place. Section 9. Agamemnon must have been the most powerful of rulers of his day, and it was for this reason that he raised a force against Troy. Not because the suitors of Helen were bound to follow him by their oaths which they had sworn to Tyndareus. Pelops, according to the most reliable tradition in the Peloponnese, came there from Asia. He brought great wealth with him, and, settling in a poor country, acquired such power that, though he was a foreigner, the whole land was called after him. His descendants became still more prosperous. Eurystheus was killed in Attica by the sons of Heracles, and before setting out, he had entrusted Mycenae and its government to his relative Atreus, the brother of Eurystheus' mother, who had been exiled by his father because of the death of Chrysippus. When Eurystheus failed to return, Atreus, who had the reputation of a powerful man and who had made himself popular with the Mycenaeans, took over at their request. Since they were frightened of the sons of Heracles, the kingship of Mycenae, and all the land that Eurystheus had ruled, so the descendants of Pelops became more powerful than the descendants of Perseus. It was to this empire that Agamemnon succeeded. and at the same time he had a stronger navy than any other ruler. Thus, in my opinion, fear played a greater part than loyalty in the raising of the expedition against Troy. It appears, if we can believe the evidence of Homer, that Agamemnon himself commanded more ships than anyone else, and at the same time equipped another fleet for the Arcadians. And in describing the scepter which Agamemnon had inherited, Homer calls him of many islands and all Argos his king. As his power was based on the mainland, he could not have ruled over many islands, except for a few that were near the coast, unless he had possession of a considerable navy, and from this expedition we can make reasonable conjectures about the other expeditions before that time. Section 10. Mycenae certainly was a small place, and many of the towns of that period do not seem to us to be particularly imposing, yet that is not good evidence for rejecting what the poets and what general tradition have to say about the size of the expedition. Suppose, for example, that the city of Sparta were to become deserted, and that only the temples and foundations of buildings remained. I think that future generations would, as time passed, find it difficult to believe that the place had been really as powerful as it is represented to be. Yet the Spartans occupy 2/5 of the Peloponnese, and stand at the head not only of the whole Peloponnese itself, but also numerous allies beyond its frontiers. Since, however, the city is not regularly planned, and contains no temples or monuments of great magnificence, it is simply a collection of villages. In the ancient Hellenic way, its appearance would then not come to expectation. If, on the other hand, the same thing were to happen to Athens, one would conjecture from what met the eye that the city had been twice as powerful as it in fact is. We have no right, therefore, to judge cities by their appearances rather than by their actual power, and there is no reason why we should not believe that the Trojan expedition was the greatest that had ever taken place. It is also equally true that it was not on the scale of what is done in modern warfare. It is questionable whether we can have complete confidence in Homer's figures, which, since he was a poet, were probably exaggerated. Even if we accept them, however, it appears that Agamemnon's force was smaller than forces nowadays. Homer gives the number of ships as 1,200, and says that the crew of each Boeotian ship numbered 120, and the crews of the ships of the Philoctetes were 50 men for each ship. By this, I imagine, he means to express the maximum and minimum of the various ships' companies. In any case, he gives no other figures for the crews in his catalogue of ships. The men not only rowed in the ships, but also served in the army, as is made clear in a passage about the ships when he states that the rowers were all archers. Apart from the kings and the very highest officers, it is unlikely that there were many men aboard who were not sailors, especially as they had come across the open sea, carrying all their equipment with them, in ships that had no decks, but were built in a fashion of the old pirate fleets. If, therefore, we reckon the numbers by taking an average of the biggest and the smallest ships, they will not appear very great, considering that this was a force representing the united effort of the whole of Hellas. Section 11. The reason for this was not so much the shortage of manpower as the shortage of money. Lack of supplies made them cut down on their numbers to the point at which they were expecting they would be able to live off the country in which they were fighting. Even after their victory, which they won on landing, it is clear that there must have been a victory. Otherwise they could not have put up fortifications round their camp. It does not appear that they brought the whole force into action. Instead, they cultivated the soil of the Chersonese and went on plundering expeditions because of their shortage of supplies. And it was because of this dispersal of their forces that the Trojans managed to hold out for 10 years of warfare, since they were always strong enough to deal with that fraction of the Greek army which at any one time remained in the field. If, however, Agamemnon had had plenty of supplies with him when he arrived, and if he had used the whole force in making war continuously without breaking off for plundering expeditions and for cultivating the land, they would have won easily, as is obvious from the fact that they could contain the Trojans when they were not in full force but employing only whatever portion of their army happened to be available. If therefore they had all settled down to siege at once, they would have taken Troy in a shorter time and with less trouble. As it was, just as lack of money was the reason why previous expeditions were not really considerable, so in the case of this one, which was more famous than any others before it, we shall find, if we look at the evidence of what was actually done, that it was not so important as it was made out to be, and as it is still, through the influence of the poets, believed to have been. Even after the Trojan War, Hellas was in a state of ferment. There were constant resettlements, and so no opportunity for peaceful development. It was long before the army returned from Troy, and this fact in itself led to many changes. There was party strife in nearly all the cities, and those that were driven into exile founded new cities. 60 years after the fall of Troy, the modern Boeotians were driven out of the Arne by the Thessalians and settled in what is now Boeotia, but used to be called Cadmes. 20 years later, the Dorians, with the descendants of Heracles, made themselves masters of the Peloponnese. Thus, many years passed by, and many difficulties were encountered before Hellas could enjoy any peace or stability. and before the period of shifting populations ended. Then came the period of colonization. Ionia and most of the islands were colonized by the Athenians. The Peloponnesians founded most of the colonies of Italy and Sicily, and some in other parts of Hellas. All of them were founded after the Trojan War. Section 13. The old form of government was hereditary monarchy, with established rights and limitations. But as Hellas became more powerful, and as the importance of acquiring money became more and more evident, tyrannies were established in nearly all the cities. Revenues increased, shipbuilding flourished, and ambition turned towards sea power. The Corinthians are supposed to have been the first to adopt more or less the modern methods of shipbuilding, and it is said that the first triremes ever built in Hellas were laid down in Corinth. Then there is the Corinthian shipwright, Aeminocles, who appears to have built 4 ships for the Samians. It is nearly 300 years ago, dating from the end of the present war, that Aeminocles went to Samos. And the first naval battle on record is the one between the Corinthians and the Corcyraeans. This was about 260 years ago. Corinth, planted on its isthmus, had been from time immemorial an important mercantile center. Though in ancient days traffic had been by land rather than by sea, the communications between those who lived inside and those who lived outside the Peloponnese had to pass through the Corinthian territory, so Corinth grew to power by her riches, as is shown by the adjective wealthy, which is given to her by the ancient poets. And when the Greeks began to take more to seafaring, the Corinthians acquired a fleet, put down piracy, and being able to provide trading facilities on both the land and the sea routes made their city powerful from the revenues which came to it by both these ways. Later the Ionians were a great naval power. This was in the time of Cyrus, the first king of the Persians, and his son Cambyses. Indeed, when they were fighting against Cyrus, they were for some time masters of all the sea in their region. Then Polycrates, the tyrant of Samos, made himself powerful by means of his navy. He conquered a number of the islands, among which was Rhamia, which he dedicated to the Delian Apollo. The Phocians, too, when they were founding Marseilles, defeated the Carthaginians in a naval engagement. Section 14. These were the greatest navies of the past, and even these navies, though many generations later than the Trojan War, do not seem to have possessed many triremes, but to have been still composed, as in the old days, of longboats and boats of 50 oars. Triremes were first used in any numbers by the Sicilian tyrants and by the Corcyraeans. This was just before the Persian War and the death of Darius, who was the king of Persia after Cambyses. There were no other navies of any importance in Hellas before the time of the expedition of Xerxes. Athens and Aegina and a few other states may have had navies of a sort, but they were mainly composed of 50-oared boats. And it was at the very end of this period, when Athens was at war with Aegina, and when the foreign invasion was expected, that Themistocles persuaded his fellow citizens to build the ships which they had fought with at Salamis. Even these ships were not yet constructed with complete decks. Section 15. All the same, these Hellenic navies, whether in the remote past or in the later periods, although they were, as I have described them, were still a great source of strength to the various naval powers. They brought in revenue, and they were the foundation of an empire. It was by naval action that those powers, and especially those with insufficient land of their own, conquered the islands. There was no warfare on land that resulted in the acquisition of an empire. What wars there were simply frontier skirmishes. No expedition by land was sent far from the country of its origin with the purpose of conquering some other power. There were no alliances of small states under the leadership of the great powers, nor did the smaller states form leagues for action on a basis of equality among themselves. Wars were simply local affairs between neighbors. The nearest approach to combined action was the ancient war between Chalcis and Eretria. On this occasion, the rest of the Hellenic world did join in with one side or the other. Section 16. Different states encountered different obstacles to the course of their development. The Ionians, for instance, were a rapidly rising power, but King Cyrus and his Persians, having eliminated Croesus, invaded the country between the river Halys and the sea, and brought the Ionian cities on the mainland into the Persian Empire. Later, Darius, with the aid of the Phoenician navy, conquered the islands as well. Section 17. And in the Hellenic states that were governed by tyrants, the tyrant's first thought was always for himself, for his own personal safety, and for the greatness of his own family. Consequently, security was the chief political principle in these governments, and no great action ever came out of them. Nothing, in fact, that went beyond their immediate local interest, except for the tyrants in Sicily, who rose to great power. So for a long time, the state of affairs everywhere in Hellas was such that nothing very remarkable could be done by any combination of powers, and that even the individual cities were lacking in enterprise. Section 18. Finally, however, the Spartans put down tyranny in the rest of Greece, most of which had been governed by tyrants for much longer than Athens. From the time when the Dorians first settled in Sparta, there had been a particularly long period of political disunity. Yet the Spartan constitution goes back to a very early date, and the country has never been ruled by tyrants. For rather more than 400 years, dating from the end of the late war, they have had the same system of government, and this has not been only a source of internal strength, but has also enabled them to intervene in the affairs of other states. Not many years after the end of tyrannies in Hellas, the Battle of Marathon was fought between the Persians and the Athenians. 10 years later, the foreign enemy returned, and with his vast armada, for the conquest of Hellas. And at this moment of peril, the Spartans, since they were the leading power, were in command of the allied Hellenic forces. In face of the invasion, the Athenians decided to abandon their city. They broke up their homes, took to their ships, and became a people of sailors. It was by a common effort that the foreign invasion was repelled, but not long afterwards the Hellenes, both those who had fought in the war together and those who later revolted from the king of Persia, split into two divisions, one group following Athens and the other Sparta. These were clearly the two most powerful states, one being supreme on land, the other on sea. For a short time the wartime alliance held together, but it was not long before quarrels took place, and Athens and Sparta, each with their own allies, were at war with each other, while among the rest of the Hellene states that had their own differences now joined one or the other of the two sides. So from the end of the Persian War till the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, though there were some intervals of peace, on the whole these two powers were either fighting with each other or putting down revolts among their allies. They were consequently in a high state of military preparedness and had gained their military experience in the hard school of danger. Section 19. The Spartans did not make their allies pay tribute, but saw to it that they were governed by oligarchies, who would work in the Spartan interest. Athens, on the other hand, had in the course of time taken over the fleets of her allies, except for those of Chios and Lesbos, and had made them pay contributions of money instead. Thus the forces available to Athens alone for this war were greater than the combined forces had ever been when the alliance was still intact. Section 20. In investigating past history and in forming the conclusions which I have formed, it must be admitted that one cannot rely on every detail which has come down to us by way of tradition. People are inclined to accept all stories of ancient times in an uncritical way, even when these stories concern their own native countries. Most people in Athens, for instance, are under the impression that Hipparchus, who was killed by Harmodius and Aristogeiton, was tyrant at the time, not realizing that it was Hippias who was the eldest and the chief of the sons of Pisistratus, and that Hipparchus and Thessalos were his younger brothers. What happened was this. On the very day that had been fixed for their attempt, indeed at the very last moment, Harmodius and Aristogeiton had reason to believe that Hippias had been informed of the plot by some conspirators. Believing him to have been forewarned, they kept away from him, but as they wanted to perform some daring exploit before they were arrested themselves, they killed Hipparchus when they found him by Leocorium organizing the Panathenaic procession. The rest of the Hellenes, too, make many incorrect assumptions not only about the dimly remembered past, but also about contemporary history. For instance, there is a general belief that the kings of Sparta are each entitled to 2 votes, whereas in fact they have only 1, and it is believed, too, that the Spartans have a company of troops called Petanate. Such a company has never existed. Most people, in fact, will not take the trouble in finding out the truth, but they are much more inclined to accept the first story they hear. Section 21. However, I do not think that one will be far wrong in accepting the conclusions I have reached from the evidence which I have put forward. It is better evidence than that of the poets who exaggerate the importance of their themes, or of the prose chroniclers who are less interested in telling the truth than in catching the attention of their public, whose authorities cannot be checked, and whose subject matter, owing to the passage of time, is mostly lost in unreliable streams of mythology. We may claim instead to have used only the plainest evidence and to have reached conclusions which are reasonably accurate, considering that we have been dealing with ancient history. As for this present war, even though the people are apt to think that the war in which they are fighting is the greatest of all wars, and, when it is over, to relapse again into their admiration of the past, nevertheless, if one looks at the facts themselves, one will find that this was the greatest war of all. In this history I have made use of a set of speeches, some of which were delivered just before and others during the war. I have found it difficult to remember the precise words used in the speeches which I have listened to myself, and my various informants have experienced the same difficulty. So my method has been, while keeping as closely as possible to the general sense of the words that were actually used, to make the speakers say what, in my opinion, was called for by each situation. And with regard to my factual reporting of the events of the war, I have made it principle not to write down the first story that came my way, and not even to be guided by my own general impressions. Either I was present myself at the events which I have described, or else I heard them from eyewitnesses whose reports I have checked with as much thoroughness as possible. Not that even so, the truth was easy to discover. Different eyewitnesses give different accounts of the same events, speaking out of partiality for one side or the other, or else from imperfect memories. And it may well be that my history will seem less easy to read because of the absence in it of a romantic element. It will be enough for me, however, if these words of mine are judged useful by those who would want to understand clearly the events which have happened in the past and which, human nature being what it is, at some time or another, and in much the same ways, be repeated in the future. My work is not designed to be a piece of writing to meet the taste of the immediate public, but was done to last forever. Section 23. The greatest war in the past was the Persian War. Yet in this war, the decision was reached quickly as a result of 2 naval battles and 2 battles on land. The Peloponnesian War, on the other hand, not only lasted for a long time, but throughout its course brought with it unprecedented suffering for Hellas. Never before had so many cities been captured and then devastated, whether by foreign armies or by the Hellenic powers themselves. Some of these cities, after capture, were resettled with new inhabitants. Never had there been so many exiles, never such loss of life, both in the actual warfare and in internal revolutions. Old stories of past prodigies, which had not found much confirmation in recent experience, now became credible. Wide areas, for instance, were affected by violent earthquakes. There were more frequent eclipses of the sun than had ever been recorded before. In various parts of the country, there were extensive droughts followed by famine, and there was the plague which did more harm and destroyed more life than almost any other single factor. All these calamities fell together upon the Hellenes after the outbreak of war. War began when the Athenians and the Peloponnesians broke the 30 years' truce which had been made after the capture of Euboea. As to the reasons why they broke the truce, I propose first to give an account of the causes of complaint which they had against each other and of the specific instances where their interests clashed. This is in order that there should be no doubt in anyone's mind about what led to this great war falling upon the Hellenes. But the real reason for the war is, in my opinion, most likely to be disguised by such an argument. What made the war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. As for the reasons for breaking the truce and declaring war, which were openly expressed by each side, they are as follows.